All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into the world of so-called ghost guns. We're also going to be looking at 3D printers and, well, the whole complex world of gun control legislation.
Yeah, it really is its own world.
It is. And, at the center of all this is a bill from Congressman Ritchie Torres. It's H.R. 3993.
Okay.
And it's about way more than just what's written down,
It really is fascinating how this bill connects to this bigger story. I mean, you've got Congressman Torres' background, his constituents, and really the values that he's bringing to this whole fight against gun violence.
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to unpack today, right? So we've got the bill itself, excerpts from his website, and even some news snippets to give us a sense of where things stand.
I was going to say, it's good to have that context.
Yeah, so it's not just going to be legal jargon all day. We're really trying to get at the human element here.
I like that.
What's driving this legislation? You ready to get into it?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Ghost guns. Everyone's heard the term, but what actually are they? Like, what makes them different from the guns we see in the movies?
That's the key question. It's all about traceability, or I guess the lack thereof. Unlike your traditional firearms, which have serial numbers, these ghost guns are, well, they can be assembled from kits. You can buy these kits online.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they don't have those crucial identifying marks.
So we're talking like DIY firearms, basically.
We got it.
And people are putting these together with parts from these kits, and that's why it's so hard to track them.
Exactly. This isn't your grandfather's gun show purchase, you know.
No. Right, exactly. This is a whole different ballgame. And this is where H.R. 3993 comes in, right?
Yeah, this bill takes a really different approach. Instead of just going after the person who actually, pulls the trigger, it aims to hold the makers and sellers of those ghost gun components accountable as well.
Especially if those guns are later used in a crime?
That's right. It's a bold move.
It is. So instead of just focusing on who pulled the trigger, they're going after the entire supply chain.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that strategy used in other areas, like with drug trafficking.
Right.
And it's had, mixed results.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. But I think on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that the landscape of firearms has changed.
Yeah.
People can potentially build these weapons at home now. So going after that supply chain, that's one way to try to cut off the problem at the source.
It almost sounds like, trying to regulate the internet.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, always a fun challenge, right? And speaking of challenges, the bill also specifically mentions holding facilitators accountable. That seems, I don't know, kind of broad, right?
Yeah, that's a really crucial detail, and it could have huge implications depending on how it's interpreted. I mean, think about it. Who exactly is a facilitator under this bill? Is it someone who sells a hard-to-find part online? What about someone who shares instructions on how to put a ghost gun together? Or even online marketplaces that host this kind of information? It gets really complicated really quickly.
Yeah, it really does. It almost sounds like this bill is trying to send a message like, if you're involved in putting ghost guns out there, you could be held responsible for what happens.
I see.
But at the same time, there's a really fine line between selling a product and actually helping someone commit a crime.
Absolutely.
So how do you even begin to draw that line legally?
Right, and that's where things get really interesting from a legal perspective.
Yeah.
Because now you're talking about potentially holding someone liable for actions they didn't directly commit.
Wow.
That raises all sorts of questions about intent, responsibility, like how far can accountability really reach?
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how those arguments play out in court.
Definitely. And we also can't forget about the bill's focus on interstate commerce.
Right.
For those who might not be familiar with that term, what does that actually mean in this context?
So in the simplest terms, interstate commerce refers to buying and selling stuff, goods and services across state lines. And this is really important here because it gives the federal government the authority to regulate these transactions, including things like online sales of those ghost gun parts, which often, cross state lines.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's essentially an attempt to close a loophole.
So it's about trying to set a national standard, recognizing that ghost guns aren't just a local problem anymore. This bill is really aiming to tackle this from all sides. But before we get into the weeds of whether it'll actually pass or not, I think it's important to understand a bit more about Congressman Torres himself.
I agree. I think often understanding the motivations behind a piece of legislation, it's just as important as understanding the legislation itself.
Totally.
So who is Ritchie Torres and what led him to champion this particular bill?
Well, his website paints a picture of someone who's really rooted in his community. He was born and raised in the Bronx. And he talks about how his family relied on public housing and how they faced a lot of the same struggles that his constituents are dealing with today.
Interesting.
And you immediately get a sense of the challenges that his community has faced. Poverty, lack of opportunity, and this ever-present threat of gun violence.
And this focus on holding the broader ecosystem accountable is interesting, right? Especially considering his own experiences growing up.
Exactly, and he's not afraid to talk about these issues either.
Yeah, he seems very straightforward in his approach. He doesn't just talk the talk, he's walked the walk. That personal connection, I think, fuels a different kind of passion when it comes to actually crafting policy. It's one thing to read about gun violence in the abstract.
Yeah.
It's another to actually see it happening in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. And he lists his priorities on his website pretty clearly. You've got affordable housing, economic inequality, strengthening those social safety nets. These are more than just talking points for him, it seems like.
Right, they reflect the day-to-day struggles of his constituents.
Exactly.
And it's also worth pointing out that he puts a lot of emphasis on representing essential workers. He's talked about how the pandemic really exposed a lot of the existing inequalities in our system, especially in his district.
Right.
And, he sees those issues as being really intertwined with the problem of gun violence.
Which brings us back to H.R. 3993, right?
Yeah.
I mean, on the surface, it's easy to see it as just, a bill about ghost guns. But when you look at it in this larger context, it seems like it's also a response to all of these bigger systemic issues that he's so passionate about.
I think that's a really important point. This isn't just about the weapon itself. It's about the environment that allows these weapons to proliferate in the first place. And, it's about the consequences for communities like the one he represents.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, I'm sure this bill has faced some pushback along the way. I mean, gun control is such a contentious issue, probably always will be.
You're not wrong.
So, I don't know, are there any counter arguments that we should be thinking about here?
Oh, absolutely. For example, Second Amendment advocates, they might argue that this bill overreaches, that it could end up punishing people who really had nothing to do with any criminal activity.
And that's a valid concern for sure. I mean, how might Congressman Torres respond to that based on what we know about his values?
Well, he always emphasizes his commitment to the safety and well-being of his constituents, right?
Right.
So he might argue that the potential harm from these unregulated ghost guns, it outweighs the concerns about overreach. He would probably point to the tragic instances of gun violence that have happened in his district and really highlight the need for these kinds of proactive measures.
Yeah, it's like this classic clash of values, individual rights versus collective safety.
Right.
There's rarely an easy answer.
It's the tension at the heart of so many of our policy debates.
For sure. So where does H.R. 3993 stand right now? What's the next step in the process?
So right now, the bill has been referred to the House Committee on the Judiciary.
And what does that actually mean for, the average person who's following this issue? What does the Judiciary Committee even do?
Okay, so think of it like this. The Judiciary Committee, they're like a filter for legislation. They have the power to review the bill, maybe request some revisions. They can hold hearings, hear testimony from experts and other stakeholders.
Okay.
And they're really going to be scrutinizing the bill's language, looking at the potential impact, whether it's even constitutional, all of that. And ultimately, they're the ones who decide whether it moves forward for a vote by the full House of Representatives.
So a lot hinges on their decision. What are some of the factors that might influence whether they give it the green light?
Well, there are a few things that come into play. The current political climate is a big one, obviously.
Yeah.
We also can't ignore the political leanings of the committee members themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, their stances on gun control are definitely going to influence their decision.
For sure.
And then you've got the level of public support or opposition that the bill's generating.
Right.
So it all creates this really complex web of influence.
Sounds like it's not just about the bill's merits. It's also about the political realities surrounding it.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more complicated. You could have a really well-crafted bill. It could address a critical issue. But without the political will to push it forward, it can just get stalled indefinitely.
Which is why understanding the legislative process, all those potential roadblocks, is so important.
It's true. Knowledge is power. The more we understand how things actually work, the better equipped we are to advocate for the changes we want to see.
Absolutely. So we've got this bill, right? And on the surface, it's about this very specific issue, ghost guns. But when you really dig into it, you realize it's also connected to all these broader themes like poverty, inequality, the role of government.
And I think it's crucial to remember that personal element we talked about.
Right.
This bill didn't just appear out of thin air. It's a product of Congressman Torres' own experiences, his values, his commitment to the people he represents.
Definitely.
And understanding that human story, I think it adds a whole other dimension to the discussion.
It does. It really does. It's like we've gone beyond just the legal jargon and actually tapped into the why behind it all. It's a good reminder that these policies, these aren't just like abstract ideas, They're about real people. And I'm curious, what about the folks Congressman Torres represents? How do they feel about this bill? Especially given that they're the ones dealing with the realities of gun violence every day.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, it's one we don't always have a clear answer to. I mean, it's safe to say there are probably a mix of feelings out there. Some people might see this bill as a really important step.
Yeah.
Especially if they've been directly impacted by gun violence.
Yeah, especially with ghost guns being so hard to trace. They might see this as like the only way to hold someone accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have other people. Maybe they even support gun control in general. But they might be worried about the bill's language.
Yeah.
Like how it could impact law-abiding citizens.
It's that same debate we always have, right? Trying to balance individual rights with keeping everyone safe.
It's a tough one, and there's no easy answer.
Definitely not.
And it's something that Congressman Torres is clearly wrestling with, trying to address this very real problem of gun violence, but also uphold, fairness, due process, all of that.
It just goes to show how complicated it is for these lawmakers, right? When they're trying to deal with these nuanced issues. So I guess as we wrap up our deep dive here into H.R. 3993, I'm left thinking about, I have a question for you, the listener.
Always leave them wanting more, right?
Exactly. So think about all the other laws and bills you hear about out there, the ones that really grab your attention, good or bad. And how would you feel if you knew more about the people behind them, like their story, where they're coming from, what they value? Would that change how you see those decisions?
Now, that is a question worth thinking about, because at the end of the day, legislation, it's about people. It's about the real-world impacts.
Their lives, their community.
And the future we're all creating together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We'll leave you with that thought. Keep asking those tough questions. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.